So why do we perform standardized testing? Well, there's really sort of two primary purposes for standardized testing. First is to determine eligibility. And typically for determining eligibility, we use what's known as a discriminative or a norm-referenced test. We may also use standardized tests to measure progress. And for measuring progress or establishing some sort of baseline or developing goals, we actually want to use an evaluative or criterion referenced tool. So what's the difference between norm-referenced and criterion-referenced tests? Well, this is really important because, again, these tests have very different purposes, and sometimes physical therapists and other therapists actually use these types of tools incorrectly. So norm reference tests, again, are often used to determine eligibility. These are probably what you think of when you think of standardized tests. They're standardized on groups of, quote, normal children. And so they are comparing the child you're testing to the standardization sample of typically developing children. These tests typically include items that aren't necessarily functional or things that a child would do in their day-to-day life. A lot of times they're very novel skills. So they really are trying to get a snapshot of that child's motor development. And again, typically these tests shouldn't be used to track change over time or for program planning, because the way that these tests work and the type of information that they provide is really just a snapshot. They don't really give information. If you administer these tests multiple times, they don't give you a sense of progress. Criterion reference tests, however, are designed to measure progress. They evaluate individual performance in relation to a fixed standard. So these tests are not designed on standardization samples of large numbers of children. They really just have a lot of different tasks. Oftentimes the tasks are very functional, kind of routine-based activities, and just kind of look at whether the child can complete those tasks or not. And so these tests are really designed to be given over time and to compare the child to himself over time. And so these tests may be used for program planning or to track change over time. So when we're deciding on a standardized test, it's also important to note the psychometric properties of the test. And so we want to choose a test that is reliable, and which basically means the results would be repeatable. We want to know that the test is valid, that it actually measures what we intend it to measure. We want a test that is sensitive, and what sensitivity refers to is that the proportion of children with atypical development that will have an atypical result. So basically a test with high sensitivity will minimize false negatives. On the flip side of that, we also want a test that has good specificity, and so that refers to the fact that the proportion of children with typical development that will have a normal test result. And so high specificity is going to minimize false positives. And so, no test is going to be perfect, but we want to find a test that has the best psychometric properties and that really balances sensitivity and specificity, so we don't have a high risk of either over or under identifying. When we score standardized tests, there are a number of kind of scores that we get. Almost every test, whether it is a criterion or norm reference test, gives us a raw score. So basically that usually just refers to the number of items correct or a percentage of items that they got correct. A criterion reference test will oftentimes just end there. They'll just give you a raw score, and then that score, you can compare that score to the score the child got the next time. However, a norm reference test is actually going to then give you additional scores. And one of those that is oftentimes particularly meaningful to parents and family is age equivalence. And so this is the mean age when 50% of children would have tested similarly. So this is when we can tell parents that, that your child is 9 months old, but their gross motor skills are at approximately the 7-month level. We get that information by giving a test that gives us an age equivalence. Norm reference tests also typically give us a developmental quotient. And if you think of a developmental quotient, you can sort of compare that to what oftentimes what we think about is an intelligence quotient or the IQ test. And so when we think about when somebody's given an IQ test, their score is then put on a curve and it's forced on a curve where 100 is the average score. And so that's kind of what a developmental quotient does, is it basically takes their score and compares it takes into account their age and then forces it onto a curve where 100 is average, and one standard deviation is between 85 and 115. And so many tests will give us that developmental quotient. Oftentimes we also get a standard score. This can sometimes be a Z-score or a T-score, and this is expressed in terms of standard deviations. So we'll get whether the child was, 1 standard deviation below the mean, 1/2 standard deviation above the mean, etc. And then a very important distinction to make is a percentile versus a percentage. And so norm reference tests oftentimes will give us a percentile. So because those tests are normed on large groups of children, when we give the child the test, we get a score, and we're able to find out what percentile that child falls in. So for example, we may give a child an assessment and we find out that their score is in the 15th percentile. So that does not mean that they got 15% of the items correct. What it does mean is that their gross motor skills are as good or better than 15% of typically developing children their same age. So a percentile of 50%, the 50th percentile, would be considered average. And when we're looking at providing services for children, we typically don't get really concerned unless a child scores below the 10th percentile. And oftentimes even the 5th percentile is what we look at as being a concern. And it's important to remember that even if a child is below the 5th to 10th percentile, that doesn't always mean that there's something wrong. That's just one kind of piece of the puzzle. And so we take a look at that in the context of the rest of the child's development, and we have to remember that these standardization samples, out of 100 kids, there are 5 typically developing children that are going to fall at or below the 5th percentile. So it's important to remember that percentiles can give us some information about the child's development, but they aren't necessarily a completely definitive picture. A percentage obviously just refers to the percent or a number of items that the child got correct. So this is a little bit more analogous to just the raw score. And again, percentage is often given to us in a criterion reference test. Another way that you can kind of remember the difference between a percentile and a percentage is, I may give you an exam and you got an 80% on the exam. So you received your percentage is 80%. But if your score was the highest in the class, you may have been in the 99th percentile compared to the other students in your class. And so similarly, if you got if only 3 students in the class scored worse than you, then you're in the 10th percentile for your class on that test, even though your percentage is an 80%. So important distinction. So let's go through a few kind of examples and discussion of different tests and how you may use and interpret them. So Ryan is 4 months, 23 days. He was administered the Infinib. He received a 5, the maximum score on 12 of 15, or 80% of items. His total raw score was 67, which places him in the transient category. He was also administered the Alberta Infant Motor Scales, receiving a raw score of 11. This places him in the 5th percentile with an age equivalency of approximately 3 months. So which one of these tests would have been, given the scores and the way that the scores were reported, which one of these tests would have been considered a criterion reference test, and which one is considered a norm reference test? And the INFINIB would be considered a criterion reference test. And we know that because we really just got a raw score and a percentage versus the Alberta Infant Motor Scale, which is a norm reference test. And we know that because we received a 50th percentile and an age equivalency. So we know that was that's a test that's normed and scored against a normative sample. This is a table of selected standardized tests, and these are tests that are actually available in our physical therapy department, and you'll be able to choose from these tests to actually practice administering on children as part of this course. And so you can review this chart and see that each test has its own age range, purpose. All of them are fairly short. None of them take more than an hour, so the time to administer are fairly consistent. List whether it's criterion or norm referenced, and then under psychometrics we see that all of the tests have been found to be reliable and valid, and the Bailey 3 is actually considered to be a gold standard for young child assessment. So after reviewing that chart and taking a look at some of the cheat sheets on standardized tests that I've posted on Blackboard, come back to this video and you can do these examples. And we're going to start here with Alyssa. Alyssa is an 11-month-old child with a developmental delay. You have been contacted to complete the motor portion of her evaluation to determine whether she is eligible for early intervention services. So which one of these assessment tools would be the best and most appropriate for Alyssa? Well, first we want to look at the age range. So the Alberta Infant Motor Scale, the Peabody Developmental Motor Scales, and the INFINIB would all be appropriate for Alyssa in terms of her age range. So we could give any of these tests to an 11-month-old with a developmental delay. But the key word here is that we need to do a test that is norm referenced because we need to determine eligibility. And if we're doing the motor portion of her evaluation to determine eligibility, we need percentiles and standard scores. So we're going to have to do a norm reference test. So that eliminates the INFINIB. And then the other thing we need to consider is if we are doing her evaluation to determine whether she's eligible for early intervention services, then we know that we're going to have to look at both fine and gross motor. We can't just look at gross motor skills. And so the Alberta Infant Motor Scales really just looks at gross motor skills, sitting, standing, prone, and supine. So the best choice in this example would be the Peabody Developmental Motor Scales, because we could do both the gross motor and the fine motor scales and put those together for a total motor quotient and get a total motor score in order to determine Alyssa's eligibility for early intervention services. The next example is Jacob. Jacob is a 5-year-old with a diagnosis of Down syndrome. He's just moved to the school district where you work, and his IEP includes PT as a related service. You would like Jacob to perform a standardized test to ensure Jacob's skills are reflective of his IEP goals and to establish a baseline against which to measure progress. So which one would be the best assessment tool, the Bailey 3, the Peabody, or the gross motor function measure? Well, first and foremost, we know that Jacob is 5 years old, and the Bailey 3 only goes up to age 3.5. So we have to eliminate the Bailey right off the bat. So we're left with the Peabody and the gross motor function measure. And because we're trying to use an assessment tool that will help establish goals and measure progress, we probably want to look at a tool that's criterion referenced versus norm referenced. The PDMS-2 is a norm reference test. The gross motor function measure is a criterion reference test. And although the gross motor function measure was really developed for children with cerebral palsy, it has actually been validated on children with Down syndrome, and so is appropriate for children with Down syndrome. So for this example, the gross motor function measure would probably be your best choice to try to assess his skills and establish a baseline against which to measure progress. And then finally, we have the example of Aidan. Aidan is a 4-year-old boy. He has recently received a diagnosis of autism and has been referred to your school district to determine whether he is eligible for public school special education services. So again, we need to look at his age, his eligibility, and whether we're determining eligibility, which in this case we are. And so think about which test would be best for him, the PDMS-2, the Bailey-3, the PD, or the gross motor function measure. And then we're going to think about Aidan again from that previous example. And now it's been determined that he is eligible for special education preschool, so we don't need to determine eligibility. But now we'd like to administer a test to determine how his motor skills impact his school function so that you can plan his physical therapy services and goals. And so looking at these tests, you can think about which one may be the most appropriate for Aidan. And I'd like you to work out these two examples yourself, and we'll talk about them in class and see what you came up with.